I always look forward to speaking with our next guest. He has a lot of insight on matters of war, foreign policy, and history, and his historical series in Truth Dig rather, excuse me, has been inching up to the present day. So at some point today, I'd love to talk to him about this, but I have some other things on my mind. I am speaking of Danny Sjursen, retired U.S. Army officer, former major. You first knew him, if you're a member of the Zero Hour audience, as Major Danny Sjursen. He's a former history instructor at West Point as well. He's a writer. He's served tours of duty with reconnaissance units in both Iraq and Afghanistan, and wrote a memoir and critical analysis of the Iraq War entitled Ghost Riders of Baghdad, Soldiers, Civilians, and the Myth of the Surge, and he joins us now. So first of all, Danny, welcome back to the program.
Oh, thanks for having me. Always glad to talk with you.
Same here. And before we get started on some of the material you've been putting out, one thing I really wanted to talk to you about, because it's been on my mind and I think on the minds of some of my friends and allies as well a lot recently, and that's whether we can build a cross-ideological alliance or movement working to end our our country's imperial and military strategies that I think have caused enormous harm around the world and here at home. And I especially wanted to talk to you about it, number one, because you write so well and insightfully on the subject, but number two, because I see that your own publications on military policy come out in locations that are both left and right. You write this history series and other pieces as well for Truth Dig, which is a left publication, but you also, I've seen your work at antiwar.com, which is a libertarian site. I've seen your work at American Conservative. So first of all, just out of my own curiosity, what's your own history? And I don't meet too many people who publish in such a broad array of ideological sites. So how did that happen?
A lot of it happened by accident. I think it's clear from my writing. I don't write a lot about domestic policy, so I think some people might be unsure of where I fall in line. But I'm wearing a T-shirt that says Jesus was a liberal. So I am personally on the progressive left, right? My hero is Eugene Debs. Okay, just to give you an idea of where I fall. That being said, early in my writing career, the first person to pick up anything I wrote and actually publish it, besides the book actually published first, so I did that backwards. Most people write articles for years and then get a book. But my first article was actually picked up by Tom Engelhart, old editor at Pantheon Books, who runs the website Tom Dispatch. Now, Tom's a member of what I would call the old left. I hope he doesn't mind me using that phrase. But after that, a lot of the people that started picking up my writing came from the libertarian right. And we're talking, of course, about antiwar.com, which would repost everything from Tom Dispatch, and then offered me a column, which was exciting. It was my first weekly column. They're obviously on the libertarian side. The American Conservative was very interested in my writing, and in fact, I was reached out to by two different think tanks that I've done work for, both of which are libertarian tanks. So there's Defense Priorities in DC, which is a relatively newer think tank, and then there's the Future of Freedom Foundation, which was affiliated with Rand Paul's father, which is also libertarian. So my think tank work has been almost exclusively with libertarians, not for lack of trying to find a left-wing gig, but it turns out there's not a whole lot of money on the left, in general, but also in the foreign policy sphere. So there's not a lot of left-wing anti-war think tanks, which is actually a little disturbing. So that's my own personal history. So I've been writing across the spectrum for a while. I've always thought, and it used to bother me, that there wasn't enough of a natural alliance, or there wasn't enough work done to forge what I always felt was a natural alliance between the libertarian Rand Paul right and the progressive, Bernie Sanders and even Mike Lee when it came to Yemen, when he co-sponsored a bill, of course, with Paul. I'm trying to work on that. And I think my writing is an effort to do that. My speaking is an effort to do that. I bring this point up in almost every talk I give because I want to reach out to as many people. I want the big tent when it comes to anti-war. I don't personally care what you think about healthcare. I mean, I do, I have my own opinions, right? I'm for single payer, but I'm not an expert on that. And my first priority, and the one that I have expertise in, is ending the forever wars. And so I'll work with anybody regardless of how they feel about tax policy, right? And I want to say one more thing about this. There is a burgeoning movement for this, and I'm glad to be loosely affiliated with it, and maybe more eventually. There's a new think tank called the Quincy Institute, which is opening its doors, I believe, in November. And I know a lot of the people involved. Andrew Basovich and Trita Parsi are sort of two of the bigwigs over there. And it is solely focused on anti-interventionism and restraint in foreign policy. It is a veritably anti-war think tank that's forming. And it spans the bipartisan spectrum from libertarian to progressive. And that's obvious if you look at some of, and this is public knowledge, if you look at some of their donors, which include George Soros and Charles Koch. That makes a lot of people uncomfortable because a lot of people feel that those two individuals have a lot of baggage. So some people don't like either of them. Some people don't like one or the other. But I think in some ways it's a really positive sign of at least a nascent movement that allies the two, I think, natural forces of alliance.
I think that's a valid point, and there's so much to react to there. First of all, starting with your Jesus was a liberal t-shirt, I'm going to be a little provocative and suggest that Jesus was a leftist. I don't know, maybe Judas was a liberal. I don't know. But
right.
But having said
Jesus was a socialist, most likely, right?
Yeah, he was a socialist. I think so. And so is the Dalai Lama, by the way. We had a guest on talking about that. He's self-described socialist. But in terms of the alliance of left and right, on this issue, on this matter of the forever wars, it's complicated for me because, well, really it's not. I guess it's complicated to talk about in certain circles because of the concerns you've described. In other words, you have people who are, look, I myself have written extensively about the Koch brothers and their corrupting influence on American power. I think that's a terrible thing, and it's something that's been one of my issues to cover as a journalist for years now. On the other hand, if their money is part of an effort that can help and prevent even a single Afghan wedding party from being bombed by an American drone, then who am I to say that I can't continue my efforts to change the American system, political system, and David Koch's role in it, while the late David Koch or Charles Koch, while at the same time still allying wherever possible to prevent those unnecessary deaths and that waste of American treasure that goes along with it. Just a quick story, and then I want to flip back to you. Even on economic issues, after the crash, when there was the Goldman Sachs backdoor bailout through AIG, I spoke at a rally outside the Treasury Department here in Washington, D.C., and a writer for the right-wing website Town Hall came up to me and said, there's nothing you said in your speech that could not have been said at a Tea Party rally. And my reaction was, invite me. I'll go. I'll tell my story wherever people are willing to listen, even if I agree with them on other matters. So anti-war has been a great example of that. Antiwar.com, where you've had a column. They were one of the few sites, in fact, maybe the only site during the running up of the Iraq War where one could regularly go and find information about that war and what was really going on. That they were an invaluable resource. Now, I myself have been a little snarky towards libertarians at times because I think their economic views are very misguided. And Justin Raimondo, who used to run, who's unfortunately passed away, that was very annoyed with me, called me a cranky old man, which was funny because I think he was older than I am. But I think we all need to figure out, and especially those of us who do have other issues, like healthcare is one of my issues, we need to figure out how to debate some issues and yet work together on other issues, because I really, and I'm curious your thoughts on this, I really score or grade the left, the American left, institutional and otherwise, pretty low on its international policy, on its awareness of the harm its policies do around the world. I think for a lot of Democrats, the attitude has been, if the president is a Democrat, it's okay. If the president's a Republican, it's a moral sin. And I think the left needs to get more educated on that. So anyway, I'll put it back to you for thoughts.
Well, I agree with you about the left. As a member, tacitly and cautiously, of the progressive left, I'm frustrated all the time by the lack of focus on foreign policy. I think there's a lot of cowardice that goes into that. I think there's a lot of insecurity. I think since the Cold War, the left, and especially Democrats, right, mainstream Democrats, have been totally fearful, terrified even, of being brushed with the weak on communism, weak on terror, brush that really is toxic. I mean, it destroys campaigns, right? It destroys political careers. So they're scared of that. And so because of it, they've actually gotten into the habit of ceding foreign policy to the right, right? And that's utterly problematic, because to me, you cannot talk about the lack of healthcare in America. You cannot talk about the economic inequality in America, the lack of paid child, care, unless you also connect it to the forever wars and the fact that our Pentagon budget is officially around $750 billion, but in reality is closer to $1 to $1.5 trillion when you include all the intelligence services and the paramilitaries, right? So, Eisenhower said in 1953, that essentially, every bomb that is built, every missile that is built is a school and a barn and, you name it, and a hospital that's not built. Okay, we have to get back to that. Okay, and that was a Republican. Now, of course, Eisenhower wouldn't be a Republican today. He'd be mainstream or maybe even further left Democrat, especially on foreign policy. But nevertheless, you had a Republican saying that, and I think that should be the rallying cry of the left. A person like Bernie Sanders is perfectly positioned to do that. He does it sometimes, but by no means as much as he should. Let me say one more thing about the left. Here's proof that the left has demonstrated a lot of hypocrisy when it came to foreign policy. Now, when the Libya intervention, the Libya regime change, which eventually, of course, turned out to be a predictable failure, and Obama even admitted it was the biggest mistake of his presidency, and he called it a shit show, and that's his quote. Only 9 people in the Senate signed on to essentially a letter that opposed this unilateral executive action, because that's what it was, against Libya. And it was sponsored by Rand Paul, and not a single Democrat signed on, not even Bernie Sanders, of course, independent socialist. So when Obama was president, he got a pass. And I think that's been the nature of the liberal foreign policy. And today, now that Trump's in charge, it's gotten really twisted, because often Trump, at least in his words, not necessarily his actions, has been calling for pulling out of the Middle East, calling for less intervention. And in response, the mainstream left, not the alternative left, not Truthdig, not alternate, not those kind of outlets, and certainly not you, but the mainstream left, the Rachel Maddows of the world, have suddenly done a 180. They've without any self-awareness, they've done a 180, and now they're saying, let's bring John Brennan on the show. Let's bring even, recycled neocons like Crystal and such on the show. And let's say that Trump is wrong and we should stay in Syria and we should stay in Afghanistan indefinitely. To me, that's the ultimate sellout, and it's why I agree with you that in many ways the left has been worse on foreign policy and on pushing for anti-war than the right. I think the standout example or exception is Tulsi Gabbard.
Well, I would agree with you on Tulsi Gabbard, and I would also agree with you on your general assessment of the left. And again, we're talking with retired U.S. Army Major Danny Sjursen and writer extraordinaire Danny Sjursen. I would also say that another case where I was very disappointed with the left was when Edward Snowden made his initial revelations. And I think an interesting split appeared in terms of because left is an amorphous term, right? I mean, some people think left means you have to be a socialist or further. Other people think left means anybody who votes Democratic, even when the Democratic Party is espousing former Republican policies. So I think, granted that it's an amorphous term, but when Snowden, you and I have never talked about Edward Snowden, but when Snowden made very important revelations, things everybody should know about what their national security apparatus was doing, you had people like me, who called him a hero, continue to believe he's a hero, You had a lot of people in the Democratic establishment, because I think largely because there was a Democratic establishment saying he's just a kid. There were talking points that, had been circulated. He's just a kid. He shouldn't be making these decisions. He's no Dan Ellsberg. Well, I know Dan Ellsberg. He is Dan. Dan Ellsberg thinks he's Dan Ellsberg, and we've
That's
had
right.
Dan Ellsberg on the show, and he agrees that Edward Snowden did the same thing he did. And I remember Rachel Maddow, who you mentioned, tweeted out, I guess, trying to keep both her constituencies happy, the party establishment and her audience, said, gosh, I just don't know what to think about this Snowden guy. And my response was, think exactly the same thoughts you would think if the president was a Republican, as the president was when Dan Ellsberg did his Pentagon Papers reveal. In other words, and what you've talked about, I mean, I couldn't agree with you more, Danny Sjursen, about the disappointment. I mean, I wrote a piece called "The Resistance Needs Better Heroes," which shows you what I think about the left embracing people like Brennan, whose report on whose report as DCI on election interference, I thought was just using it as an opportunity to target the left, or James Comey, or any who was at that point in history, once again, a resistance hero. So I guess the question is then, how do we bring the left along? And of course, I don't mean to diminish, there's some great people doing activist work on the left. There's some great people allying, or beginning to ally with people on the right. There's Quincy Institute that you mentioned, Andrew Bacevich, who is a conservative actually, but great on these issues, been on the show a couple times. He's part of that, as you mentioned. I know some good people from the liberal or left side have gotten involved, but what do we do to advance this awareness on the left? Obviously, write and speak, as you were doing. Any other thoughts on what can be done?
Well, that's a difficult question. And before I jump into that, I do want to do what history dorks do, which is bring up a little bit of history. First of all, Bacevich is someone I'd like to consider a close friend, mentor, colleague, just an absolutely great guy who has proven that you can come from a small C Catholic, or small C conservative, big C Catholic background and still be incredibly astute on these issues. And I think that watching his political transformation, I've been following his career since 2005, has been absolutely remarkable. And in fact, he came out for Obama, who of course was a disappointment, which I spoke about in my article. But you talk about the left, and the left has always been bad on this issue of anti-war. It has traditionally been fractured. And I just finished a long piece for the Future of Freedom Foundation that will come out in 2 parts in the next 2 months about World War I civil liberties and how that connects to the war on terror. And what I want to say about this is there was this very, very powerful big P progressive movement during the First World War. Okay? Woodrow Wilson, who was a Democratic president, he liked to call himself a progressive, and in many ways he was, but in way more ways he was not, right? He was highly racist, and he eventually touted this war. Well, what happened in that period was 80% at least of the prominent progressives went along with Wilson and went along with the war, and in fact attacked themselves, as the left does, eating its own, right? Attacking the radicals, or what they called radicals, who stood against the war. And only a small percentage, headlined by guys like Eugene Debs and, of course, Randolph Bourne, who famously said war is the health of the state, actually stood up for their values. And the outcome is World War I not only fractures the left, but it breaks the progressive movement. I mean, and most historians agree with that. So my point is, this has always been a problem. So what do we do? Well, that's extraordinarily difficult. Writing, speaking, it only goes so far. Unfortunately, we live in an oligarchy where think tanks are very prominent, lobbyist groups are very prominent, and so I think there actually has to be a political alliance. So yes, we need grassroots activism, and yes, we have to be willing to speak with people who we may not like everything on their Twitter feed. Okay, you mentioned libertarians. I work for libertarians. I told you I'm willing to say this. I've said it to them. I love them to death. I find them exhausting on domestic policy. But I put that aside to form the alliance. I'm willing to talk to guys who I don't like everything on their Facebook. And we have to be willing to do that. And sometimes the left, especially the more hard progressive left, gets a little bit too dogmatic. And the right does this too. Where if you don't pass 100% the purity litmus test, right? If you don't pay attention to your pronouns, then you can't be an ally in the movement. We have to get past that. If if our primary goal with people like me, that's where my expertise is ending forever war so that we can then use that money to build a social welfare state, well, I'm willing to ally with people who want to end war for it, but with different outcomes. They want more tax cuts. They want less government interference. They want their money back. Well, we'll argue that point. We'll take it to the American people. We'll take it to the electorate once the wars are over. But we don't even get to that place until the wars are over. So I think one of the biggest things is we just need to talk to each other. We have to work in the swamp to some extent, but we also have to go to the people and the grassroots, because the mainstream system, whether it's the courts, the Congress, or the executive, right, all three branches of our constitutional state, they've all failed us. None of them are going to save us. So I think to some extent it's people protesting, it's people making alliances, it's shutting down the system if necessary. Okay, I'm willing to go that far. And if that, sometimes that means surrounding a congressional office, and making your point known. And so I think street activism is incredibly important as well.
I love that you mentioned street activism, Danny Sjursen, and three reactions to that. The first is, I got to tell you a quick story, which is I was on an anti-war panel with an editor, a libertarian editor from Reason magazine, and we were. He was a likable guy. And afterwards, I said, 30% of what you people say is completely reasonable to me. The rest is nuts. And he said, I'll take 30%. He was kind of laughing, and I laughed. And I said, but when I say nuts, I mean like you're on a first date with somebody and it's going well, and then all of a sudden they start telling you how aliens are communicating to them through their teeth. And he saw for a second, he said, well, there's very convincing evidence of life on other planets. I thought, okay, he's a good guy. He's got a good sense of humor. So we will have pleasant moments as we build those alliances. I guess the second thing, I have to say this as a fellow history nerd, I wrote a piece looking at the fact that during the Second World War, exploring the Muslims, quote unquote, of the time, were actually Germans, were Trump's ancestors. It was the German community that was hated and feared, considered the outsiders, considered the potential traitors. Their places of worship were spied on, their businesses were harassed and shut down, newspapers censored, and so on. So it's interesting that Trump has such a lack of empathy for a minority that is experiencing exactly what German Americans experienced in the early 20th century during the run-up to and during the Second World War. And lastly, I wanted to ask you about the other dimension of getting a movement, and the challenge that our movement needs to confront is the national security establishment. Edward Glennon, who's been on the program too, wrote a book called National Security and Double Government, talking about the role of the national security establishment, the people in the various institutions and close to them and so on, who make sure policy doesn't change that much. I mean, this is something that goes back to JFK, often considered a liberal hero, but definitely a Cold War figure. But up to the present day, there's this national security establishment of people. Anyone who deviates from the orthodoxy of forever war, to use that phrase, is considered no longer legit and is not going to get the publications, is not going to get the job postings. At least that's my sense of it. So I feel as if we're up against that national security establishment as well. And I'm curious about your thoughts as to how to respond to that.
I think the national security state is consumingly powerful. I think it is potentially the greatest threat to American democracy, to our ostensible republic. I think the revolving door between four-star generals and the arms industry and corporate boards is a perfect example. Saint Mattis, right, who's been canonized by the left-wing media, right, or the supposedly left-wing, right, the mainstream liberal media, went to work for General Dynamics right after the military, and he just went back to the board. Well, he's making seven figures doing that. And General Dynamics is the fifth largest arms dealer in, the U.S. corporate state. This is a very, very big deal. Now, here's what's up. MSNBC is supposedly the most left-wing of the three major news channels, but they're all corporate entities and they're all prisoners of the national security state. If MSNBC was a truly progressive station, truly anti-war, it would never have hired James Clapper, former DNI under Obama, John Brennan, former CIA director under Obama, David Frum, right, who wrote the Axis of Evil speech for Bush. He was the enemy, right, of MSNBC back then, but suddenly he's been rehabilitated because he doesn't like Trump, right? And you even get guys like Bill Kristol who are on these shows. So we've got recycled neocons and we've got militarist, interventionist, quote, liberals from the Obama administration. So any news station, right, any media outlet that pays these people and puts them on TV is not on our side, right? And what America really needs is an alternative media that can somehow grab enough of an audience, especially if it can be TV, because that really matters a lot. That says no, we eschew all of that. We don't want to talk to anybody from the national security state, because the national security state itself is the enemy. To steal a line from Trump, that's the enemy of the people. And you know what? Trump supporters make me very uncomfortable on a number of levels, specifically their xenophobia and their racism. But for a people that have dozens of wild conspiratorial theories, one of their conspiracy theories might just hold water. And it's this concept, I don't like the term, but it's this concept of the deep state. There is something that resembles a deep state, but it's really just the conventional national security state that's been in place since Truman's National Security Act of 1947. So yes, I think this all-consuming national security state is absolutely the number one threat to our democracy.
You know, there's this thought experiment, and I've thought about writing about it. It's not as easy as it sounds, but perhaps I will someday, that I've conducted. I worked for Bernie Sanders in 2015, 2016 on his presidential campaign. And there's this thought experiment I've conducted, which is if Bernie had somehow won and become president of the United States, how would whether you call it deep state, whether you call it double government, which is Glennon's term, whether you call it national security establishment, which I do just to, not get trigger people. I think the deep state now triggers people on the left. What would they have done to undermine anything Bernie Sanders or any other left candidate, or for that matter, Rand Paul and a libertarian president might want to do to unwind us from these wars? See, I think the left, with its embrace of these establishment figures, many of whom, by the way, Brennan, Clapper, and so on, seem to be documentably liars, okay, among other things. And many of whom have conflicts of interest, have profited personally, and accumulated great wealth off the war machine and so on. So really not likable characters or honorable characters, in my view. What would they have done to undermine a truly a progressive president, or whatever we want to call it, regarding foreign policy and military policy? And what might they do in the future? How might we mentally arm ourselves for that to come in the future, if we're lucky enough to have a president who wants to wind down our war apparatus a little bit?
Of course, for me, the Bernie Tulsi ticket, of course, is sort of my dream, right? But it's not going to happen. I think the national security state would do the exact same things they've done to Trump, except to more of an extreme, because whereas Trump is full of bluster, I think someone like Tulsi Gabbard and even Bernie is full of substance and might actually try to make moves to pull us out of our 7 shooting wars and our 25 other interventions across the greater Middle East. You'd see the same things. There would be the Fox News and to some extent CNN would be full of talking heads from the national security state saying that Bernie Sanders is unqualified, dangerous. He's going to cause the next 9/11 by pulling us out of the Middle East. You'd see leaks from within the White House, from the unelected members of the national security state, and they would do everything possible to undermine him and maintain the status quo, because most members of the national security state, the quote experts, they're more of the same characters. That's what they are. They have only one thing, one tired idea on offer, and it is more of the same. That means more war in the Middle East, more tension and a new Cold War with Russia and China. And if you don't agree, by the way, because I've been called a tool of RT and all this, if you don't agree with the new Cold War with Russia and to some extent with China, then you are a Putin, right? Then you are a Putin apologist, right? You're a useful idiot for Putin. And that kind of narrative, which has been really now espoused by the liberals, is ultimately extraordinarily dangerous, and it harkens back to that First World War era, where to be German was to be lynched, and where to be a pacifist was to be un-American, and potentially even imprisoned in federal prison for 10 years, like Eugene Debs. So look, we're seeing history repeat itself. I don't like that phrase, because I think history rhymes more than it repeats itself. But nevertheless, if you don't know your history, you are, of course, doomed to repeat it. Forgive the platitude. And I think a truly progressive anti-war president would find themselves seriously undermined by the national security state, and would find their job and their prospects for re-election utterly, utterly subverted and sabotaged by a very panicked national security state, or, as the Trump people like to say, deep state.
Well, terrified, panicked, and ruthless, I would say. And if we're talking about history, we might also mention the 1950s and 1960s, when Cold War liberal was a phrase very much in use and very apt. So I would argue we need to be preparing now. I wish we had time to get into the whole Russiagate thing, but I too have been called Putin's puppet. I too have questioned, well, you didn't say you questioned the narrative around that, but I assume you do, at least in the sense that it's being used to promote a new Cold War. You know, I'm old enough to remember when liberalism meant at least an affinity for peace. And that meant, we should be talking to Russia, even if we disagree with them, even if our interests don't align. Now it seems there's an element, not in control, but an ascendant element of a kind of Cold War liberalism that says, no, we shouldn't talk to them. There should be no diplomacy with them. They're responsible for everything bad that happens to us, and we need to never question the national security establishment when it tells us that anything we believe in is actually a product of Russian manipulation. So before we go, since I brought that up, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that Russiagate is one of the great farces and the great wools being pulled over the eyes of the American people. And I think it's ultimately has the potential to not only reelect Trump, but to devastate for a generation the Democratic Party. So I'm fully in agreement with you. Because I've espoused those beliefs, I have been called a Putin stooge. So I'm glad to be part of your club of un-Americans, which I find fascinating, because I spent my early years in the Army shooting at targets on the range that looked like men that were dressed up as Soviet soldiers with red stars on their helmets. We used to call them Crazy Ivans, So everything I learned about being a reconnaissance officer was to fight the Cold War, because I came on just only 8 years after the Cold War ended. So I find it fascinating that someone would call someone who spent their career in the military a Putin apologist, because I think that's absolutely ludicrous, but it speaks to the tenor of our times. Bring me back on for another episode, please, and we'll talk about an alternative history of and I think more accurate history of the Cold War and post-Cold War U.S. relations with Russia, because while Russia and Putin are certainly not innocent, while I don't personally like Putin's ruling philosophy, I would be willing to make an argument that the United States has, in many cases, been as or more nefarious of the actor, and in many ways has set the groundwork, is responsible for the groundwork of this new Cold War, more than Russia and even Putin.
Well, we will have that conversation. I look forward to it. And by the way, before we go, as someone who has not served in the military but represented the United States through the State Department, on behalf of the State Department in nearly 20 countries, I agree with you that I think it's interesting that I'm now labeled an apologist for another government, including being in that part of the world when communism fell and being part of that entire effort. So with that, unfortunately, we'll have to leave. And again, for our listeners who are not watching, it's Danny Sjursen, Sjursen. Look his writing up. It's terrific. And Danny, as always, great talking with you.
Yeah, great conversation, and look forward to doing it again.
Same.